Welcome to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, before we move on, I had intended with this episode to jump ahead to the question of, can we use consensus building to generate moral values? Can we use that as a foundation? But before we do that, there is one more topic I want to touch on, one more set of quotes that I think is going to help us down the road a little bit. I want to go back to a debate between Dinesh D'Souza and Christopher Hitchens. It's a great debate from 2008. It's in St. Louis. And we're looking, and it's in the show notes, by the way, so the link will be in the show notes. The quotation that we're going to look at starts during the 41-minute mark. And D'Souza presses Hitchens on a question that is going to be extremely relevant to us. D'Souza presses Hitchens on this question of, where in a Darwinian model do moral values originate? And I want you to watch this clip. I've left the question in there so you can see D'Souza's question and Hitchens' response. I want you to watch this. The clip's about 2.5 minutes long. Listen to the entire clip. Listen to Hitchens' answer. And then I want to come back and I want to analyze that and talk about what Hitchens fails to answer and why it's important and where we see this go. So take a look at that, and we'll be back in just a moment.
I do want to, if I may, come back and answer your point about Jefferson for this reason. I do think that the brotherhood of man does not follow from our status as Darwinian primates. If you look to the animal kingdom, you don't particularly see that theme stressed, for example, in the chimpanzee colony or among a pride of lions. The idea of domination, the idea of the strong conquering the weak, that appears to be evident in the animal kingdom. You've argued relentlessly that we are on a complete continuum with that, and yet you find us all assenting to a completely non-Darwinian principle. First of all, the guy who's a complete stranger, nothing to me genetically, and I could care less about him, I should, in some sense, posit him as equal to me. The meaning of self-evident is not that we don't need God for it. It means it's not evident at all. It's a moral, not a factual proposition. Because people are not equal in strength or speed or beauty or intelligence or any quality that we could specify. The self-evident means that there is a moral equality, and I want to ask you, what is its Darwinian origin?
The debate between William Jennings Bryan and
Darrow.
No, H.L. Mencken and we're talking, I'm sorry, about the Scopes trial in Tennessee, Dayton, Tennessee. Klaus Darrow and H.L. Mencken. Turned to a great extent, there's a very brilliant essay by Gary Wills on this, on whether or not William Jennings Bryan's suspicion was correct, that social Darwinism was in the background. That, in other words, that if the teaching of evolution by natural selection and random mutation, that's the bit that's often left out, was accepted, that it would mean that the poor, the lame, the halt, the weak, and so on could be simply told, well, it's just too bad. You are that way because nature has made you so. Now, as anyone here can tell, there is no necessarily such corollary. There might be someone who says that's so, but it would not be, I think, discernible by anyone here that I, for example, who do believe that we have evolved by random mutation combined with natural selection for success in certain genes, believes that someone who is born blind or deaf and so on is simply to be left by the wayside. There's no such corollary.
Now, one of the things I hope you noticed in that quote, in that answer that Hitchens provides to D'Souza is he doesn't actually answer the question. And D'Souza calls him out on it about a minute or so later. I didn't want to pull in any of the rest of the clip because Hitchens starts wandering down a path. If you've ever watched Hitchens' debates, he has a tendency to do that. I'm not saying he does it on purpose, but in this case, he fails to answer the question, and then he begins meandering down this path about National Geographic and never quite gets to a good answer. What I want you to notice is this, and I want to go back and quote from him and see if you notice where this goes and where the problem lies in all of this. Because this is going to be our bridge to start talking next week about using a consensus to get there. Hitchens says, there might be someone who says that that's so, but it would not be, I think, discernible by anyone here that I, for example, who do believe that we have evolved by random mutation combined with natural selection for success in certain genes, believes that someone who is born blind or deaf should simply be left by the wayside. Okay, now, this is the problem. He's put an answer on the table. He just answered where his morals come from, and it's his opinion. So I'm again not saying anything bad about Christopher Hitchens. Hitchens said, I don't believe that at all. But he can't say why. That's his personal belief. That's how we would go about consensus building. We're going to talk about that next week. Before I move on to Charles Darwin, I want to quote, I know D'Souza there addresses a quote from earlier in the debate when they were talking about Jefferson. And I love this quote from G.K. Chesterton on the Declaration of Independence and the idea of all men being created equal. Chesterton says, the Declaration of Independence dogmatically bases all rights on the fact that God created all men equal. And it's right. For if they were not created equal, they were certainly evolved unequal. There is no basis for democracy except in a dogma about the divine origin of man. Chesterton nails that point. No one can look around and actually say that when you look at in any way, shape, or form, by any attribute, all men and women are not equal. It's clearly the case. But that's okay, and that's the point in the Declaration. It's this idea that we are created equal. It's the idea that we're recognizing as we walk through this problem of objective moral values that human beings are inherently more valuable, that there's something different about us. And that thing about us cannot be described from an evolutionary standpoint. This is what Hitchens is struggling with when he's looking at it from a truly Darwinian perspective. I want to drive home this point. I mentioned on last week's podcast that I had one of two quotations from Charles Darwin, and I used the least objectionable of the two. And I feel like, despite how just abhorrent this quote is, I probably need to put it out there. This is Charles Darwin, and recognizing where his theories lead and what Darwin, I can't argue what Darwin believed. And again, putting this out there, I hate this quote. It just makes your skin crawl. But it's important when we look at what we're talking about here. Is Christopher Hitchens right that his opinion and his belief, well, he doesn't believe that. So clearly, if he doesn't believe it, there's no evolutionary connection to where, if we were strictly left to an evolutionary perspective, how this could go so horribly wrong. That's according to Hitchens, what he's just said. Now, the interesting thing is, I want you to go back to now the founder of the theory. And what did Charles Darwin have to say? 1871, his book, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. I want you to listen to this. And again, let this quote sink in. This is bringing together a couple of different pieces from his work. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated. You probably could just stop right there because that's bad enough. But he continues. With savages, the weak in mind or body are soon eliminated. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed, and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands from whom a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. Just every single thing about this is terrible. But he continues. Here's where he's going. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. A little further on, he says, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. These are painful words to even say. And of course, this is the part of Charles Darwin that nobody likes to talk about in polite culture these days. But this is where, this is where I want to go with this. And I want you to think about for a minute. Hitchens looks at it and says, well, I don't think there's any corroboration. There's no corroboration whatsoever between where we might expect Darwinian theory to go and where he believes. He certainly doesn't see anything like that. Once the idea, though, the problem is moral values, when we look at this and we determine where do moral values come from, what Charles Darwin has put on the table is the natural conclusion that a theory like his reaches, not only with normal evolutionary biological processes, but as Hitchens mentioned, social Darwinian processes. And of course, in the years following the books that Darwin wrote, you have the eugenics movement and other things where people took that quite literally and were pushing for the breeding of the master race and things like that. The question we put on the table at this point, as you consider this and as you look at it, can you, from a naturally Darwinian place, and eventually in the episodes to come, from a consensus building standpoint, without the anchoring, without the foundation of a set of objective moral values from a divine creator, can you stop the natural Darwinian processes that Darwin here himself is referencing and that Christopher Hitchens denies? You notice throughout this quote, and this is the problem, Darwin is going through and he's talking about the fact how we've done these things for society's sake to circumvent the natural process of evolution. With comments like, with savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated. We civilized men. The breed, and again, comparisons to the breeding of domestic animals, and again, comparing that to the human race in general. You see where he's going with that. It would have reached its peak in the 1930s under the Nazi regime in Germany, trying to breed the master race. You can see the connection in where that's going. The question on the table becomes, in a purely Darwinian model, if there's nothing more than DNA and we all dance to its song, as Richard Dawkins might say, do you escape that? When you look at the political systems that remove God from the equation, when you look at those systems that try to build an effective set of moral values, purposely removing God, purposely removing things like that, what is the actual outcome of that? And when you see these ideas taking root, harmless as they might seem, when you have these ideas taking root, what is the natural outcome of these ideas? I'll give you another quote from the God Delusion. This is Richard Dawkins, and I want you to see where he goes with this and how he equalizes things as he's bringing them all together. He says, early embryos that have no nervous system most certainly do not suffer. And if late aborted embryos with nervous systems suffer, though all suffering is deplorable, it is not because they are human that they suffer. There is no general reason to suppose that human embryos at any age suffer more than cow or sheep embryos at the same developmental stage. Suffering is hard to measure, and the details might be disputed. The evolutionary point is simple. Okay, we're going back to evolution. Where does that take us? The humanness of an embryo's cells cannot confer upon it in any absolute discontinuous moral status. It cannot because of our evolutionary continuity with chimpanzees and more distantly with every species on the planet. I am not going to go down the path of discussing the topic of abortion in this podcast. But what I want you to notice is that quote. From an strictly evolutionary standpoint, there is no difference between a sheep, a cow, a chimpanzee, and a human being. Now, there is a very small minority of people who actually do believe that. But if you presented this question to the vast majority of people, and I'm not attempting to consensus build, I'm asking a question. If you looked at each one of us and said, is there a difference? If you can only save one, you have a monkey, you have a sheep, a cow, and a human being, and you can only save one of them, who do you save? I think the vast majority of us easily recognize the answer is the human being. But to Dawkins' point, from an evolutionary standpoint, you can't say that. Because we are the equivalent of moss or a tree or a slug or something else. There's no evolutionary difference. And I think you can see the problem and where this is going. Christopher Hitchens, to his credit, says, well, I don't see any, there's no connection. There's no corroborate. Okay. But Richard Dawkins, clearly, if you take what he just said, and again, we talked about Dawkins' belief last time that these were, evolutionary misfirings, that they're simply evolutionary misfirings, these moral values. And we saw last week that Charles Darwin appealed to our more noble side. There is none of this from an evolutionary perspective. What everybody has to immediately do is deny evolution when we get to the water's edge on this question of moral values. Because from an evolutionary standpoint, I hate to say it, Charles Darwin is exactly right. This is where you go. Richard Dawkins is exactly right. And when you look at political systems around the world that have implemented a strictly godless society, ruling out these things, we're going to talk about where consensus building goes here in the next few weeks. When you look at the natural outcome of that, would we expect to find a higher moral system being created in those cultures, or what we would expect to find is the deaths of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people? And I think very quickly, you'll see where this goes. So when Christopher Hitchens says, well, I don't believe that, I don't think there's any such connection, and when Richard Dawkins says these are blessed misfirings from an evolutionary standpoint, the question is, once you let that door open, once you go down this path of quotations like Darwin's, can you actually stop the natural flow of where that goes? When you look around the world at ideas like medically assisted suicide, which has become a very big deal in the press lately because Canada has fully embraced this idea. Western Europe had embraced it previously. But when you go down this path and you see the cheapening of human life, because again, from an evolutionary standpoint, there is no difference between a cow, a sheep, a chimpanzee, and us. But when you cheapen human life to a point that you're willing to start encouraging medically assisted suicide and things like that, when you reach that point from an evolutionary perspective, I think you would see from Charles Darwin's quote, and even Richard Dawkins, whether he realizes it or not, it is an incredibly slippery slope. And without objective moral values to stop you from falling, where exactly does that go? And that is what we're going to see in the episodes to come as we look at this. When you look forward and when you see all of this brought together, when we look at the reason that Hitchens struggled in answering this question from D'Souza, when you see the quotes from Richard Dawkins, and when you see, just the abhorrent quotes from Charles Darwin, when you look at that and you recognize that from an evolutionary standpoint, there is a logical conclusion that everybody goes, well, I don't go down that path. Or it's a blessed misfiring that we don't go down that path. The question is, what stops you from going down that path? And can you build objective moral values outside of a relationship with God? In the last, we've seen this enormous swing. 2,000 years ago, under Roman rule, life was cheap. And morality is like nothing that we could have possibly imagined. And then you interject into that situation the teachings of Jesus Christ. And you see this dramatic transformation across the world over the next 2,000 years, where all of this goes a very different way. And in the last 200 years, as we've seen Christianity removed from the town square, removed from the national consciousness, especially in Western Europe, but now in the United States as well, what has been the outflow of that process? Can you build moral values based on a consensus? Or do you need a solid foundation of something built, of moral values built on something far greater, something like objective moral values built on the foundation of a directive from a divine creator? This is a great place to stop, and we will pick up on this topic next week. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, I hope you'll consider hitting the like button for the episode and the subscribe button for the podcast. You can find our podcast here on YouTube, out on iTunes and Spotify. You can find our helpful information on our website, prooftograce.com. And you can reach out to us if you have questions via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope to see you next week as we continue this journey. Bye-bye.